First of all, I just wanted to thank everybody for joining us today. It's first talk from the gallery and a really lovely opportunity to share the sort of practices and the people behind the work, and that's something I feel very passionate about, so it's really nice to have this opportunity. We'll begin today with a conversation between Polly and Teagan, who will be discussing their work and practices. There'll be a chance for questions at the end of their session, so do keep your thoughts ready.
I'm Polly Carter. I'm the heritage horticulturalist at Talland House. I trained initially as in art history and worked as a curator in Brighton. And then I moved to Cornwall about 10 years ago, retrained in horticulture with the National Trust. When I finished that, I set up freelance, and I have a series of gardens that I look after with my partner, Nick. And Talland was one of the first that we took on. So Virginia Woolf, she spent 13 summers there. Her father found Talland House. I'll show you. You can see it's not much changed. He stumbled across it in 1881 on a walking holiday, and he bought the lease off of the Great Western Railway. And so from 1882, when Woolf was baby, they came down for 3 or 4 months each summer. The whole family, 8 siblings. They brought a maid and a cook and their dog Shag on the train. The train line, the branch line, was kind of recently installed, so it was the very beginnings really of this kind of second home tourist industry, and just before the kind of boom of the St Ives artists that they would have kind of been a part of, in a way. This is the garden now. Originally, there were 3 or 4 acres around the house. So behind the house, there were wild meadows and fields, and they planted gorse and heather when they first moved in, because it was countryside, basically. And that's one of the reasons that they took the house. They wanted a country retreat. There were no buildings, as there are now, around it. And the part of the garden in the front of the house is got the same sort of footprint that it had then. So the borders that I've planted with flowers now had hedges in, escallonia hedges. And then from there were further little hedged areas of garden that ran down the hill from the house to the beach. So it stands just above Porthmeor beach. And the house itself, you can see these beautiful tall bay windows with stone steps beneath. So they had this very sort of indoor-outdoor lifestyle whilst they were here. And Woolf's mother had been a model for the pre-Raphaelite artists, and her father was an author. He wrote the National Dictionary of Biography, among other things. So they had this steady stream of visitors through the summer, of artists and writers. The children, including Vanessa and Virginia, who are pictured here playing cricket in the gardens there at Talland, they would have overheard these interesting, exciting conversations, just as, you know, art and politics was changing. I think this sense of freedom of thought and also physical freedom that they had to play in the gardens, explore the gardens on their own, go down to the beach unchaperoned, as they would have been chaperoned everywhere in London when they left the house. I think this combination of physical and mental freedom supported them to think maybe we could be an artist and a writer. And in fact, they did make a pact to each other that they would be an artist and a writer. They can only have been 10, 12, something like that, because when Virginia was 13, her mother died and they never came back to Talland House after that. Well, Virginia did come back as an adult regularly, staying in various places, and peered through the escallonia hedge at the ghosts of her childhood, she would write in her diaries. I don't tend to talk too much about Vanessa because I'm so focused on Virginia and her writing currently, but you can't, as I'm sure you realise, you can't untwine the two. They related to each other so profoundly in their work and their approaches, especially into the Lighthouse, actually, which was set at Talland House. And it's autobiographical, although in the book it's set in Skye. It really is Woolf exploring her childhood and painting a portrait of her parents, and the protagonist into the Lighthouse is painting on the lawn, a picture of the house and mother and child in the window, and the novel kind of finishes with that painting being resolved. So this red arrow is pointing to Godrevy Lighthouse. That's the lighthouse, from To the Lighthouse. And these are the 3 novels that most people kind of think of them as the St Ives trilogy. So they each feature the landscape of Cornwall and, to an extent, in all of them, the house, the view from the house, coastal landscapes and garden scenes. These are beautiful additions, aren't they?
Yeah, these follow on so nicely from what you were saying about Vanessa and Virginia working so closely together, because Vanessa Bell designed these covers and you can see how well they sit together. And also then when I was designing the waistcoats, I almost lifted the colour palette directly from here because they just feel so relevant to one another constantly, I think, don't they?
Yeah. And they've just been reissued, haven't they, these
Yeah,
covers?
You can get them in the bookshops now again with these covers on, which is just so beautiful.
I'm going to just read this quote to you because I think it summarises how important Talland was to Virginia. She says, "In retrospect, nothing we had as children made as much difference, was quite so important to us as our summers in Cornwall. When they took Talland House, father and mother gave us, me at any rate, what has been perennial, invaluable. I could fill pages remembering one thing after another that made the summer at St Ives the best beginning to a life conceivable."
It sort of breaks my heart at the same time as being so beautiful, that one, doesn't it? Knowing that she lost it, but knowing that it was such a wonderful start.
So I'm just going to briefly talk about the approach that I'm taking to the restoration of the gardens at Talland. I'm not trying to get the gardens back to how it was when Virginia Woolf was there. Instead, I'm sort of going through her work and finding relevant plant references and memories and sensations and experiences and kind of exploring those and putting those into the garden, kind of in homage to her and her work, which kind of relates to, she talks about biography, her father being a biographer, that it's kind of odd that we just list what happens to people rather than how they felt and what their experiences meant to them. So this slide is just a little example of that. This is one border that I've replanted, and the colour scheme comes from a quote. Thinking of the gardens at Talland, she says, "It makes me feel warm, as if everything were ripe, humming, sunny, smelling so many smells at once. There were pink flowers and grey and silver leaves." So when we cleared this border, it had been overgrown with self-seeded bays and things. There were roses. They were pink. So I've added silvers to summon this memory. And the silvers that I've chosen are artichokes. Peculiar maybe, but that relates to a section into the Lighthouse, which is this autobiographical novel where after the mother dies, the house and garden become abandoned. They stop visiting, and she describes artichokes seeding themselves among the roses, and poppies coming up in the cabbage patch and things like that. So also I've introduced lots of self-seeding annuals for that sensation of the garden going wild and doing its thing, and fortunately that also creates quite a romantic effect, so that's lovely. I wanted to ask you, Teagan, before we start talking about the work itself, about your relationship to Woolf and her writing, because I think we both sort of had a bit of a stop-start with her, which I think a lot of people do.
Well, I knew that she had a connection to St Ives. I remember seeing their very small bit at St Ives Museum, which talks about her at Talland House, and it sort of piqued my interest, but I didn't really dig into it any further. And I did try and read To the Lighthouse when I was a teenager, and I think I did manage to limp all the way through it, but it was definitely more of a limp than a...
My first reading.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I knew it was something that I would really connect to at some point, and I could tell it was interesting. But I just couldn't quite get my head around it. And then when I moved back to St Ives in 2018, it was when the Tate exhibition was on, that was all to do with Virginia Woolf.
Oh, that's good timing.
Yeah.
And
I loved that. So that sort of got her at the forefront of my mind again. But it wasn't until we met when we were working at the Belgrave Gallery and you were talking about Talland House. And I think by then you'd started rereading her. And you were sort of telling me little bits that you'd noticed, and that got me back into it. And I actually started by listening to the audiobooks, which was a really nice bridge to actually getting into it, because it was something I found I'm not sure why I found the audio so much easier, but I did manage to get my head around it a lot more. And then when I read it after that, it suddenly felt a lot more accessible, and I suddenly got very excited about it then.
I think we mentioned when we were talking about this before that Woolf talks about rhythm being incredibly important in her work. And actually that's one of the things that the repetition of the beam of the lighthouse in her bedroom window and hearing the waves breaking from her nursery at Talland, that all feeds into this very rhythmical way of writing. So I think listening
it's
helps.
almost satisfying to listen to, isn't it? It's a really lovely experience.
Yeah.
And how about you? It's to do with your mother, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a lovely sort of full circle moment for me, because my mother was a writer and tried to get me to read Woolf when I was a teenager. She gave me The Waves, and which is my
sturdy one to start with.
It's my favourite. It's much more out there. I mean, she generally doesn't have plot and narrative in the way we think of anyway, but The Waves is, the individual characters have soliloquies all the way through, and then between that there's this beautiful poem of the sun rising and setting over Porthmeor Beach and Talland House garden. So I was obviously attracted to that one, but it's very beautiful. So I read the introduction, I think it was like the Oxford edition or something, and I read the introduction and it said, it's all about identity, and as a teenager I was like, that sounds interesting, and then didn't read it. And then my mother died when I was 18, and I didn't go back to Woolf all these years. And then when I started at Talland, I thought, I better read it. And it's just been so lovely for me reconnecting with my mother through Woolf and through the garden, which is something that it provided for Woolf as well, because she talks about writing to the Lighthouse as being a form of therapy for her, and kind of finally coming to terms with the early loss of her mother.
That's so beautiful that you came back to it at the right time.
It's reassuring, isn't it? These things kind of happen at the right time. I think we just start with the obvious, which is why waistcoats. I think I really like the fact that they have this sort of page-like effect. Do you want to tell us about why you chose that format?
It was mainly practical. I knew I wanted to work a lot with surface design, and I knew I wanted to incorporate text in the kind of form of handwriting, because it just seems so remiss to not include that when you're working with Woolf. So I decided that I did want to just practically work with a garment that was flat, so I could put my energy into making sure the image wasn't distorted. I didn't want to work with something that had lots of curved panels or anything like that. I also ended up working with a lot of Japanese silks and things, so I quite liked working with this kind of Japanese tailoring methods to make this quite simple, almost utilitarian garment. And again, I used lots of things like all the fabrics for this exhibition are secondhand. I didn't buy anything new. But I use a lot of, like, this olive one is a military twill, and then the striped one is like a French ticking, and they were kind of from the 1930s. So I liked that sturdiness with then the silk and the flowers on top.
So something about your practice that I think is really interesting is that you have a background in costume design at St Martin's. And could you tell us about how that particular training has influenced how you work, as opposed to perhaps being a fashion designer doing a fashion background or a fine art background?
Well, it was really interesting when you said that, because initially I hadn't thought about that at all, because I think I quite instinctively work in that way. But it has affected the final pieces a lot, I think, because when you're training costume, you build up almost a fact file on the person you're working with, and then you dig deeper and deeper and deeper as you go. And then you're obviously working to create an outfit that communicates with the audience what that character's like. So I think that is an interesting starting point, and it does mean that I do definitely get going with a lot of research before I start doing any of the design, which I think is quite a helpful way around for me. I quite like doing that. But it was a good practice as well, in the sense that it made me dig into what I was trying to do quite early, because I knew that I didn't want to create a costume for Woolf. I didn't want it to be creating clothes that Woolf would wear, and I didn't want to recreate clothes Woolf had worn either. I wanted it to be more how Polly works with the garden, really, embodying sort of more of a sense of Woolf and sort of something that might make people think about her and her work a little bit more, rather than it being that direct thing. And obviously that ends up being so Woolfian with the way that she wrote as well.
Yeah, it's nice. I was thinking it's kind of like being like embodying the spirit of somebody that you admire, rather than copying their style or something.
Yeah, exactly.
And I do really like that there's the link between both our approaches.
And I like that Woolf did that as well, because it wasn't sort of a stylistic thing she was trying to do in her writing necessarily. She did that because she thought that was the truest way to represent reality. And I see her point a lot that if you take a slightly more instinctive approach and you're looking sort of more broadly at all the information you have about someone, actually it being a little bit more abstract, you're probably getting a truer sense of it somehow. So I really wanted to try and move towards that if I could.
Yeah, absolutely. Woolf hated the idea of being attributed to style.
Yeah,
You know,
exactly.
she worked, and that's something she took from painting, actually, was working formally. So the way she arranged her novels, the way the chapters were connected, or the shape of the novel she talked about, the form reflected what she was exploring and what she was talking about.
Yeah, precisely.
So each novel is going to be completely different and not have a particular style.
So the fact that she wasn't a genius even once, she did it with every novel in a fresh way, is quite staggering, I think.
Well, there is something that people talk a lot about her work, which is this stream of consciousness thing. And I used to think that meant that she was writing stream of consciousness, but it refers to the fact that we're often in her characters' heads and their thoughts. So it's the character's stream of consciousness that we're connecting with. And I think that's one of the reasons people do love Woolf, because it's very intimate in that respect. And I really like that your pieces of art are to be worn, because there's that kind of physical intimacy. You know, if you love Woolf, it would be lovely to wear these. That closeness to something that you love. Looking at the detailing, apparently these were the very first waistcoats, because you kind of went on a journey, didn't you, as you worked on the waistcoats, and your ideas kind of developed as you were working on them, which again is kind of different, isn't it, to like designing a series of clothes that you have yourself to kind of have a creative development through the work. So tell us about the botanical illustrations that you've worked into these first ones.
Well, the first theme that I got sort of really struck by and really liked researching was this idea that Virginia Woolf's father was an amateur botanist, and he used to take all the siblings on these big walks all up Trencrom Hill to gather all flowers that they'd then go back and study. So I really loved this idea of them collecting all different things and kind of archiving and documenting them. And then I fell down an absolute rabbit hole of looking at all the lovely vintage botanical imagery that you can get and all the beautiful handwritten labels, which you can see was such a huge influence while I was doing these ones. And I loved using, this bit is the selvage of a piece of Japanese silk, a vintage piece. So it actually translates to say about 100% silk in the dye compositions. But there was something so lovely about this kind of like it looking a little bit like pressed flowers and them being documented. But then actually, as the project went on, I moved quite far away from that, because when Woolf uses flowers in her writing, it's actually quite a lot more abstract, isn't it?
Yeah, she often doesn't name them. She'll just say that purple flower with the tall stem or something.
Or they're a bit mashed together sometimes, aren't they? Like it's a couple of different flowers.
Yeah.
And I love that approach as well. So actually, as the project went on, I did move away from labelling them, because I quite liked her approach that you're actually just looking at the flower and what the symbolism might be behind it and all things like that. And also I quite like that it gave me some creative license to make them a little bit more stylised as well and not have to sort of recreate them exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. I really wanted to show you a photograph of Teagan's waistcoat with a crocus on it at this stage, but it's been sold, hasn't it?
Yes, sold and taken, I'm afraid.
We don't have a photo of it, unfortunately. But I really love, it was one of your early ones as well, wasn't it?
The crocus was one of the first flowers I settled on.
Yeah, and it's beautiful. It's kind of embroidered, and you get the sense of the paperiness of the bulb, and the bulb is on the pocket, and then the flowers growing out of the pocket, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I loved that kind of, you were thinking about childhood collecting, when you collecting shells off the beach, and I think of my process in the garden as kind of going through Woolf's work and collecting things and then putting them back in the garden. And it's like when you find something that you want to keep, a stone or a pebble or something, you put it in your pocket. It's like you've
Which
done
I
that.
love is quite a childlike urge. We've got to remember that when Virginia Woolf was at Talland, she was a child, so they would have been snuffling through the garden for snail shells and little pressed flowers and things. I think that's a really lovely theme to take from it. Yeah,
it's lovely. And the crocus kind of relates to the optimism of this quote as well, because you discovered, didn't you, there's a Woolf herbarium online, and the crocus kind of represents the spark of creativity.
Yeah, I was so excited to work with the crocus. It was I think it was actually the first flower that I did decide to properly work with, because I really liked that the crocus, I think, I like the way it looked all the way through all its life cycles as well. I felt lots of the times I depicted it as kind of drooping the lower petals, but then it's still this beautiful symmetrical shape. But I liked as well that the crocus has so much symbolism in all different cultures all the way through history. And yet, personally as well, I think loads of people like crocuses because they're the first ones you see kind of poking up through the snow. And in the Victorian language of flowers, which I think Woolf would have been aware of, even if she didn't directly refer to it a lot in her writing, it would have been around at the time. The crocus symbolises renewal and rebirth and things like that.
It's kind of unavoidable because of when it comes out.
Yeah, you can't deny its optimism with the crocus, can you? It is just a lovely, lovely flower.
Isn't it?
Exactly. And then I love that when Woolf uses it in her writing, she uses it to symbolise the return of creativity, which I just thought was beautiful. And so I can entirely see why she thought that when she saw the crocuses. And the quote that I picked to go on that waistcoat is from Jacob's room, and she's talking about the return of vitality and colour after an eclipse. And she says, but the colour returns, runs up the stalks of the grass, blows out into tulips and crocuses, which I just think is a beautiful, beautiful image.
I love that. It reminds me of, there's Dylan Thomas poem called The Green Fuse That Drives the Flower. And she's very aware of this sort of life force that's in nature. And
that's exactly the word, life force.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm reading a book at the moment called Braiding Sweetgrass by a Native American botanist, Robin Wall Kimmerer. And she talks about her native language having a word for that thing. Which, you know, all gardeners are aware of. But we don't have a single word for it. So you've moved on from the kind of the plates to this more sort of cut-out style with the second-hand fabrics. I really like that this sort of almost collaging effect echoes the beginning of To the Lighthouse, the very opening scene, the mother and child sitting in the window who are being painted. The child is collaging. He's cutting out a magazine and putting it together. And people have suggested that's kind of referencing kind of reconciliation, kind of personal growth and reconciliation. So could you tell us about why you chose to start working in this way here?
I was so thrilled when you pointed out that parallel to begin with, because I was using it in somewhat of a more practical sense. So I was thrilled that it did align with Woolf in the end.
I mean, we've said, haven't we, that there's a lot of subconscious things that happen in these processes, aren't they? So, you know, sometimes you are guilty of, or I am guilty of layering meaning onto things afterwards.
I quite enjoyed it.
But it's, you know, it's all there in subconscious one way or another, isn't it?
Yeah. I think mainly the reason I started working with it is I knew I wanted to work with lots of different silks from the 1930s, because I felt like using fabric that would have been around at the same time as Woolf. And it was something that I could sort of imagine Woolf wearing a little bit as well. So I really enjoyed that. But when I'm cutting up old textiles, if they're silks, I only cut up ones that are damaged, because of course it would be such a shame to do that with other textiles. So I'm often working around really threadbare bits or, you know, quite weak, fragile fabrics. So using this method where I could kind of bed them down and embroider on top of them, and they were kind of backed with the canvas that I was using, practically just made them a lot more sturdy, because I really wanted the pieces that you could wear them and give them, you know, quite a tough life, and they're, you know, going to last. So it mainly came from that. But then once I was working, I found it quite pleasing as well, that then when I started working with this is obviously the Lighthouse one, but when I started doing it with the flowers, it looked quite like a children's sketchbook page. I quite liked that the flowers looked a bit pressed, or that they looked a bit like a children's drawing. I quite liked that flatness of them.
And it is lovely that you've got that reference to the style of the 20s when the book To the Lighthouse was published. Yeah. But like you say, you're not creating clothes in that style.
The next place I started using the second-hand textiles sort of really purposely was a tablecloth, and you can see it on the back panel there, that I dyed to use again in this new way. So this tablecloth was probably from the 1940s or 50s, and we can say I think was probably almost definitely done by a woman. And whilst I was doing this, I started to become really fascinated by the kind of really tactile nature of a lot of women's work, whether that's kind of gardening, mothering, sewing or knitting or cooking. So I started working a little bit with hand imagery, and I loved that there were sort of multiple women's hands that would have worked on this piece from using this tablecloth, and then I spent a long time embroidering it, and then someone else is going to go on to wear it. I quite like that process in it as well.
Yeah, and again, there's a nice echo there to the Lighthouse, because Mrs. Ramsey, well, she's knitting a lot in it, but also the book is a comment on the kind of invisible work that she did. So when we talked about it before, you said, you know, these things include emotional labour and things like that. And the in the book, all the guests that come and stay at the house over the summer, she is kind of directing all of them all of the time, kind of setting up marriage proposals and making sure that there's a famous dinner scene which takes place in one of the bay windows of Talland House, is the dining room to the Lighthouse. And you because you have this stream of consciousness of her thoughts, you can hear how much she is kind of working on making sure everybody's all right and talked to and everything. And you know, she kind of features in Woolf's essay Room of One's Own, when she talks about the angel in the house, and we sort of have to kill that first before we can be truly creative, because the amount of effort that goes into this kind of being a woman and looking after everybody else first. It did, you know, some people have said that it contributed to Virginia Woolf's mother's early death, because she was so overworked. So let's talk about the anemones in your waistcoats. These, I think they feature in a couple, do they?
Yeah, I use the anemones quite a lot, or variations of things that look quite like anemones quite a lot. Because on one of my visits to Talland, I think they perhaps had just come out, because they suddenly seemed so abundant and they just seemed to be everywhere, and they were so beautiful. And also there's a picture which we'll show you on the next slide, which is, oh, perfect, thank you. This is Virginia Woolf's mother sat in one of the windows at Talland, and as you can see, surrounded by anemones. So that team together made me really, really want to work with them. And I knew as well they were sort of an aesthetic that I really liked the shape of. So I did a lot of work with kind of making them look quite symmetrical. And again, I was thinking of Virginia Woolf being a child in the garden, and I quite wanted to work with these simplified forms that look a little bit like a child's drawing or a pressed flower. I found them quite satisfying to work with.
And then you also incorporated, can you see that? Yeah, the root system on the flower. Yeah. Do you want to tell us about why you chose that?
Well, I started working with the motif that you can see. I think when it was...
Oh, yes.
Yeah, just there. I started a lot of the quotes that I wanted to use reference the sun. So I started working with that little motif a lot. But there was something about using it as the roots as well. I liked that all the spokes were kind of jagged and bedding it into the earth. And I liked this kind of big overblown flower at the top with this like little ecosystem underneath. And I was trying to think a lot throughout all the work. One of a really key theme with Virginia Woolf is the subconscious and the conscious. So I liked that there was a sense of all this going on at the top, but actually an equal-sized thing going on underneath of all the little thinking that goes on under there as well.
Which also is present in her use of the sea, and that features a lot in her work as well. So below the sea being the subconscious. She talks about, when she's talking about her memories of Talland, she talks about her memories as corks marking a net. And they're actually just referencing something much deeper underneath the water. And also, I like what you say about the root system. They're kind of anchoring the flower, because she really liked very sturdy flowers for cutting. Yes. So when she finally had her own garden at Monk's House in Sussex, and her husband Leonard was the gardener, really, she did help him. It's a little break from writing, but she liked to cut the flowers and pick the fruit mainly. So
understandable.
There's also a lovely reference here that I think was partly in your mind. Was it the part earth, part flower quote?
Yeah, I love that quote.
So for me, when I started at Talland and I read a memoir essay by her called A Sketch of the Past, which is it's in a little book called Moments of Being that was published in the 1960s with a few autobiographical essays. But next year, very excited about, there's going to be a publication of just A Sketch of the Past by an American scholar, Omala Seshagari, and she's going to write an introduction to it, and it'll be its own edition. It'll be a lovely thing, because it's been written as a sort of unfinished piece. And it's quite sort of sketchbooky, Sketch of the Past. Omala suggests that this is on purpose, because that's kind of reflective of our lives. They're kind of unfinished and unperfect. But there's a quote in there when I read this essay that just blew my mind. And she talks about having an experience when she comes out the front door at Talland and sees a flower in the flower bed and realises that the flower and the earth are the same thing. It's part earth, part flower. And so this concept of interconnectedness that she discovered in the garden at Talland is what kind of really informed all of her work. And she said it also kind of made her want to write, because she realised that there's this sort of pattern underneath things that if she could write, she could discover kind of what belongs with what. So again, under the age of 13, having these quite profound realisations. So yeah, I love that you've got a part earth, part flower going on there. Yeah, so that photograph of Julia Stephen, it's probably the only photograph of their time there that accurately depicts a flower. It's the nature of the photography means it's quite hard to pick out particular flowers. But you can see on the right-hand side, I've planted the anemones kind of in memory of her. And then this bed, one of the beds at Talland, it's again based on a memory she has of her mother, and they're coming to St Ives on the train and she's fallen asleep on her mother's lap and she remembers the fabric on her mother's dress. She says blue and red and purple flowers on a black background, and then anemones, I suppose, she says. And I've planted some very dark purple pittosporums in the middle of the bed for the black background, and then used that colour scheme. When you were doing your research for your waistcoats and thinking about the whole Talland project, and I think it really sort of stirred your imagination, didn't it? You thinking about Woolf as a child in that space. And I very much get that, because when you're gardening, you're kind of in the borders and you're seeing things that, the children may have seen, like the snails on the leaves. And you've introduced some insects on some of the waistcoats, which I love. That's very much part of that experience, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And I liked a lot of the quotations in her books around insects. I just thought were beautiful. I really identified with a lot of those. And I just think it was so lovely thinking of Woolf as a child in that garden and being so happy at that time in her life. And I liked making all the flowers quite tall and exaggerated as they would be. And just the sense that we were now combing through all Woolf's work to try and find these little sort of secrets of Talland. But that's also what she was doing with her memories from Talland all along, was I think it's her nephew said, didn't he?
Yeah, Quentin Bell described her time at Talland as a treasury of reminiscent gold that she sort of left in her walls.
So there's parallel of her digging through all those memories to find the writing as well. I just found so beautiful. I love that Talland had been that relevant to her and Cornwall meant that much to her.
Yeah.
I just found that really moving, and that was something that I wanted to kind of reflect with all the little bits I picked out. And insects seemed quite a nice way to symbolise that throughout.
Yeah, snails actually feature a lot in her work.
They do.
There's a book called Kew Gardens. It's a short story, and it's told from the perspective of a snail from the flower bed, and it's witnessing all these different people going past the flower bed, listening in on their conversations. And the moth, well, I think you chose a hawk moth, didn't you? Because we talked about Jacob's room. She talked about a convolvulus moth. And so parts of Jacob's room are set on the coastal, there's a kind of a sailing trip around Land's End, actually, and there's a lot of kind of wild scenery, foxgloves, which also feature on one of your waistcoats. And the convolvulus moth, I looked it up because I hadn't heard of it before, and apparently it's a hawk moth. We get lots of hawk moths here in Cornwall, which is lovely. So yeah, you've introduced the hawk moth.
Yes.
And there's a lovely quote. Shall I read out the quote?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
The moth works very well with Caroline's title for the exhibition, Fibres of Being. Only stumbled on it afterwards. So this is from a short story about watching a moth just flitting about in the window pane, as we often do, and sort of realising, hang on, I think that's about to die. But just taking in that moment. And she says, watching him, it seemed as if a fibre, very thin but pure, of the enormous energy of the world had been thrust into his frail and diminutive body. As often as he crossed the pane, I could fancy that a thread of vital light became visible. He was little or nothing but life.
Oh, that's such a beautiful one.
Yeah. And we were talking, weren't we, about, you know, that your use of the moth didn't necessarily reference that, but there's these kind of very specific universal things become available for meaning, don't they? And that's something that she...
Well, Woolf very purposely made all her work quite universal. She tried not to make anything sort of too specific or autobiographical, which I think is not only a very clever thing to do in writing, but also quite generous, because she was sort of opening it up so that, I think the way she worded it was so other people could kind of deposit their emotional connection onto it, which I think is really lovely. And me and Polly were talking a lot about that, with how lucky we are that she did that so we can comb through it for all the references we use. But then how lovely it is when you speak to people about Woolf, whether it's when they're looking at these or looking at the garden, is people have found so many bits that we were like, oh goodness, I never thought of that. But yes, of course. Yeah, which is a lovely thing. So
such a rich resource.
That was just something we enjoyed so much.
Yeah. And it's been really lovely for me working with you on this and the little bits that I have, just to draw out. One of the things Woolf says in my favourite novel, The Waves, is different people draw different words out of us. And that's why collaboration is so rich.
Yeah, definitely.
And sometimes it's stuff that's just been under the surface we hadn't realised we wanted to look at. So it's been so lovely to do this. And I've missed that, because coming from an arts background and gardening is very solitary. It's been very good for me, very good for development of my concepts when I'm on my own. But then I realised that it's, you know, this is brilliant. So I hope this is the beginning of collaboration together and with Talland and other artistic pursuits as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think we've got time to take some questions, if anyone's got any.
I realised there's a lot of research and preparation before you actually start your project, your waistcoat. How many man hours is it to actually produce a waistcoat?
Well, it varied so much because I used quite different embroidery methods with all different ones. And they definitely, I was surprised how much quicker I got as I went as well. At once, oh, you're right.
It's not Jen in there, I promise. It's actually rosemary from the garden, because apparently rosemary helps you remember.
And I found as well that I often had the idea for the next one while I was doing the last one, so sometimes it would cross over a little bit. So it was really hard to say, but I think in the shorter ones it was probably about 8 hours, and in the longer ones probably about 12.
From beginning to start?
Yes, yeah.
That's just the physical...
No. Like... From cutting the fabric, preparing the fabric and sewing it, 8 hours?
Yeah.
That's incredible.
I'm very speedy.
So these flowers, this will take me weeks. These flowers are all hand stitched. They're not.
Yeah, but do bear in mind I've been doing it for years, so it's a practice thing with embroidery, I think. And I was quite strict with myself as well, because I wanted them to be an affordable price. I didn't want them to have to end up being so expensive that it was that people would feel anxious about wearing them. I quite wanted people to feel quite comfortable with that. So I was quite strict on my timings for that reason as well.
Having the gallery deadline was quite useful as well, wasn't it? Having to create
that was very handy indeed.
For an exhibition. It was lovely that Caroline asked you, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
There's something that you'd wanted to do for a while, isn't it? And so that kind of, I suppose that helped.
Yeah, having a reason and a deadline is very handy indeed, I think.
I was going to ask you, is that how you worked on them? Did you start one, finish it, and then move on to the next, or did you do multiples? Because when you were talking, it sounded a lot like he's finished one and then moved on to the next, which is I guessed you made them. I was like, oh, she's probably got a few on the go at the same
time. Really? That's really interesting.
So like, okay, maybe she's doing a similar thing.
I sort of wish I did do them like that, because I think it would be more efficient, as they would all be feeding into each other.
But what's nice is they feel like they encapsulate your journey, which I really like. So that's, I think it's a nice thing, if that's how you work. But...
I did work very much like that. They ended up being in little pairs, and you could probably, once you see them all together, you'd probably be able to see which ones I did pair up and work together on. But it wasn't really a conscious thing. But it was quite nice as well, because we were saying with having the deadline, I did have to do it in quite a short period of time, which meant I just had to get going, and I changed direction a bit as I went and things, and I had to embrace that because of the timings. But actually, I think it worked quite nicely in the end, and I was glad I'd done it that way.
I think it's nice that there's a journey, isn't there, through them. But then
you said that like you took the labels and then you moved on from the labels, and I can see the ones with the labels, and then like I like that. It's nice. Yeah.
Oh, thank you very much.
You doing it as well, which is nice.
Would you have ideas going in your head about the next one while you're doing them?
Yes.
Yes, so you had them all as a whole.
Yeah, and I sort of relaxed into that once I got started, because it was a bit daunting because I knew I wanted to do about 10. And when I started the first 2, I definitely didn't know what I wanted all the rest to be like. And I sort of learnt to trust that a little bit as I went, and just sort of think, okay, well, by the time I'm halfway through these ones, I'll know what I want to do with the second ones, which again is quite Woolf in the sense that she wrote all her novels by walking, and that's how she mulled everything over. And I think like there's a quote in one of her diaries where she describes herself walking as snuffling along and making up phrases, which I just think is so lovely. But I like that idea of kind of doing and thinking.
Yeah.
Right. Which was the last waistcoat you actually did?
Ooh.
It sounds like your journey was quite organic, almost like planting a garden, which I think is beautiful.
I think the last one I did was the women's work one, which is the navy blue one up there. And I was almost a little bit devastated it was the last one, because that's when I started getting into all those themes of it all being to do with women's work as well. And when we were planning the talk, we were saying we could have filled the entire hour just digging into that alone, which we resisted doing. But in a way, it was actually quite nice that the last one is something that I do want to develop even more. So I'm trying not to feel sort of sad that this part of the project's closed, but actually it's exciting that there's going to be more to come, hopefully.
Yes, I can imagine that sparked so many more ideas.
Yeah, and I was in the habit of thinking of the next one while I was working, so it felt a bit flat to be working on one and not thinking of the next one.
There was something that you talked about as well, about when you were thinking about what motifs to use, what flowers, and you would kind of mull over together both the practical visual aspect of it and the meanings. And you wouldn't go for one or the other for a particular reason, but when the two came together and worked, you go, okay, that's working. And that process was quite sort of instinctual. And I have a theory about beauty in gardening, that we're drawn to beautiful combinations of plants and things because it's actually telling us something. Often it's useful for wildlife or something. So recently this Native American botanist, Robin Walker-Murrah, did a study and said that actually asters, purple asters and yellow goldenrod grow together naturally because the contrast in colours make it easier for the bees to see them and pollinate. So I was like, yes, that's my theory is proved that, you know, when you're working instinctively, no, that's a good combination. That's right. There's always a reason behind it.
I see that being true. I think lots of creative people would probably say that with colour or anything like that, there is a real something you don't quite know why or can't put your finger on. There's something ticking along with that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much for everyone for coming. It was so lovely to chat about it.